Good morning and apologies for slight lateness in the start. Can I welcome members, invited guests and the public, both here and watching on webcast, to today's meeting of the Economy Committee. Our main topic of discussion is news provision in London, and we encourage anyone to take part in the discussion on social media using the hashtags Assembly Economy and hashtag Local News. First, we have a few short items of formal business to go through before we come to our witnesses. And there's been no apologies received. Can I ask members to note the list of appointments set out at item 2 and also ask if members have any other interest to declare? Lovely. Can we confirm the minutes from our last meeting held on the 21st of February? Can we note the completed and outstanding list of actions? Thank you. Can we note the action taken by me under delegated authority as set out on the agenda? And that brings us to today's main item, a discussion on news provision in London. Firstly, can I ask members to agree the terms of reference for the discussion, which are to examine how local news provision in London has changed over the past decade and what is driving that change, and to consider the impact of these changes on the ability of Londoners to remain reliably informed on key issues in their local areas. I'd now like to welcome our guests. We do have slightly more guests than we normally would, but there were a whole range of different angles on this, so thank you everybody for coming along. We've got Laura Davison, who's the national organiser from the NUJ, Hannah Walker, who's London Managing Director and Editor-in-Chief of London Weekly News, Kerry Gould, Editor-in-Chief of Trinity Mirror, Professor Angela Phillips from Goldsmiths University of London. Michael McFarlane is going to join us around 11. Eric Gordon is here from he's editor of the Camden New Journal Group, and Martin Hosick, who is journalist and commentator, notably of Mayor Watch. And we're also expecting Linda Quinn, who is editor-in-chief of the Brixton Bugle, who again is expected around 11. So that brings us to the start of the questioning and to one of the most topical questions in London around the media at the moment, which is will the appointment of a serving politician as the editor of the Evening Standard affect the news coverage in London? Anybody
I'm
like
happy to,
okay, Laura, do you want to
kick off?
Yeah.
I mean, I think obviously there's been a huge amount of kind of shock at the announcement, and as the news has kind of settled in, that's perhaps increased. And from the NUJ's point of view, I think that the appointment sends all of the wrong signals. London needs a newspaper and not a propaganda vehicle. And it demeans journalism when someone with no experience can be parachuted into a job and at the same time retain other roles which raise questions of conflict. And I think it raises questions about the vision for the Standard and their long-term plans. As it stands at the moment, the journalists there, who obviously are proud of the newspaper's tradition and their place in the life of the city, are facing cuts to their pay and their hours because the second edition of the paper has been scrapped without consultation. And obviously there are concerns about the impact that's going to have in terms of coverage of day-to-day news in the capital. And that the post of the editor requires a range of skills and talents and experience. And I've no doubt that there are many journalists out there who would have aspired to that position, which Mr. Osborne has been gifted. And we would like to invite him to withdraw from the post and to apply in the normal way and taking part in an open competition with other journalists who are qualified for the position. And we'd absolutely welcome the intervention of the committee in terms of convening some kind of follow-up meeting with the management of the Standard, because I think this raises lots of questions and the issues that we've raised about what's happening internally as well. And we'd be very happy to take part in that follow-up session, because obviously they're not represented today.
Angela, would you like to comment as well?
Yes, I've commented on this quite a lot already, but I think that it raises issues that have been there for a very long time but have been hidden. I mean, Goldsmiths did analysis of the coverage of the mayoral election, and it was very clear from that the degree to which the Evening Standard is biased in one direction, was biased in favour of Zach Goldsmith. I mean, it's a testament to the people of London that things didn't quite turn out the way they had hoped. But I think that all this does really is make absolutely clear that the Evening Standard is a Conservative newspaper. And I think that this should raise issues for the relationship between Transport for London and the Evening Standard, because we are in a situation in this city where the only newspaper for London is allowed a monopoly of our transport system. And given what we know about the way in which people access news now, and there is now huge amounts of data about this, for a very large number, particularly of young people, particularly people who are not very engaged with news, the London Evening Standard is going to be their only access to any information about what's happening in London. Because where we're already watching, particularly in the youngest age groups, we're seeing the numbers of people watching television dropping. So that simply having a newspaper available to you on the Tube network means that this is your access to London news. And I really do think I mean, I don't know what's possible, and I don't know what's practicable, but I do think that it's time that once again Transport for London looked at whether it's actually appropriate for a newspaper that makes no pretense of being even-handed to be given a monopoly of our transport system. I mean, I know that this is an issue that's been discussed in the past, that Ken Livingstone had to deal with it in past eras and didn't get anywhere, so I'm not suggesting that it's an easy problem to solve, but it's something that really does need to be looked at, because I don't think we can even begin to pretend that the London media is serving democracy if now we're being told that basically the London Evening Standard is going to be a pulpit through which two wings of the Conservative Party can debate the future of Brexit between them. That doesn't strike me as the best role for London's only newspaper. And I think that this is something that London's politicians should be taking up across the different parties, and it shouldn't simply be taken up as a single party problem. It is a problem for democracy.
The issue with the transport system is quite an interesting one, and we maybe come back to that. We'll sort of think about.
Well, it's something. It was on my list of questions. It's something that I want to talk about. Thank you for raising that, Angela. This is for me quite a controversial topic, and I've already had emails back and forth with the chair and so on. Because of course today's meeting was supposed to be about the contribution of local newspapers to London's economy and their role in connecting local communities and businesses together. I'm very concerned about the decline. I understand that George Osborne's appointment is very topical and it's fun to discuss, but let's be frank, it's not within the remit of this committee.
I haven't finished.
It is not within the remit of this committee to invite a private company to ask their editor to step down. This is something that we had the discussion about. And I appreciate everyone making their views known, but that is not what we're supposed to be discussing today.
Explain why, if you are going to state that you don't think this is part of the remit of this meeting, I would like you to explain how it does not fit within the terms of reference of this meeting.
For the simple reason that press neutrality, as Angela has indicated, is not something that has ever existed. We're not talking about broadcast media here. This is not the BBC or any other radio or television network. We all know who the Daily Mail and Telegraph support. We all know who the Morning Star and the Mirror support. The Evening Standard seems to jump between different places. Today, they seem to be more right-leaning. They've been bought by a new Russian person who is
Kemi,
pushing things that way.
I think
That is not something that we can do anything about. We would not be having a meeting here saying that we don't like
Kemi,
the Daily Mail.
I need to ask
It is
you-
not within the terms of reference
I
of this
need to.
meeting.
Can I,
strongly
for the
disagree.
purpose of the
And
record,
I'm
Kemi,
sad,
please be
Fiona,
quiet.
that
I'm going
you
to
decided to continue
reread.
doing this
I'm going to
because I
reread.
expressed my
Kemi,
reservations
I am going to
and
have
we
to ask
agreed
you
that we were
to.
not going to
I'm
do
going to have
this.
to ask you to wait one moment while I reread the terms of reference for this discussion and then restate the question I asked. The terms of reference for the discussion are to examine how local news provision in London has changed over the past decade and what is driving that change, and to consider the impact of these changes on the ability of Londoners to remain reliably informed on key issues in their local areas. The question I then asked was, will the appointment of a serving politician affect news coverage in London? So I failed to understand how that does not come within...
about the neutrality. You've taken that word out.
No, Kemi, I did take the word out.
Yes, you took the word out. But
you
that
cannot say that I asked a question that I patently didn't ask in the meeting, Andrew.
You are the chair.
And I've ruled this line of questioning out of order.
All I'd simply say is if a Labour politician had been appointed to this job who was serving, Kemi would be the first to be jumping up and down
No, I
about it.
wouldn't.
No, can we
But
both stop this? Martin has indicated he wants to
It's
come
the
in.
remit of a private company to hire whoever they like.
Excuse me, we are putting this meeting on a very slippery course. If you two are going to just
You chose to do
argue.
that by making this the first line of questioning.
Apologies
There's
to guests.
so many important
Kemi,
things that
I'm
we
going
need
to
to
have
talk
to ask
about,
you- I'm going
and
to
we're
have to
wasting
ask
time.
you-
It's
I'm going
very
to-
sad, Fiona,
the
and I'm
only
glad that this is your
person-
last meeting chairing, and I will be quiet now.
The only person who is drawing out this line of questioning is not me. So I would just like to say, Martin, would you like to comment on this, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I do think there is a problem with George Osborne's appointment. I think it impacts on the Evening Standard's credibility, or at least where it seemed to be credible. We hear about fake news, but whilst fake news is a real thing, the problem is that people bandy the phrase around for any news coverage that they don't like as well, perfectly factual coverage. And the danger with George Osborne's appointment is it gives people who are already mistrustful of the Standard for the reasons that Professor Phillips raised earlier, it gives them an extra plank with which to dismiss Standard's factual reporting. And if we look on a number of issues, there's the coverage of Brexit. But the former mayor occupies the Foreign Office, which is a job that George Osborne was apparently rumoured to be interested in if he'd remained in Cabinet. If there's a bit of gossip that finds its way into the Standard about Boris Johnson, is that because it's a legitimate journalistic revelation, or is it because George Osborne is sulking because Boris Johnson is Foreign Secretary and George Osborne isn't? If there's a story about Theresa May and splits in Cabinet or lack of support, is that because George Osborne would like to leverage her out of Downing Street because he's still a sitting MP and has a path to power? Or is it because it's a fair journalistic story? Those people can dismiss stories about the Mayoralty, Transport for London, the Metropolitan Police. George Osborne pushed an economic policy which took £1 billion over the last 4 years and the next 4 years out of the Metropolitan Police. It's very difficult to see how the Evening Standard says to government, you must invest more in public services, when it's edited by a man who says you can take £600 million out of the Metropolitan Police in a 4-year period, and I want you to make savings in the fire brigade, and I'm going to cut money for healthcare provision. It makes a mockery of the paper's mission to speak up for London, and it undermines the work of the journalists who work at the paper. And I think that it's implausible to say that it doesn't have an impact on the trust, the wider trust in the media landscape in London.
Okay, Andrew, would you like to come in on this?
Well, I think Martin's raised an important point, particularly about the fake news issue, because Brexit, the Brexit referendum debate was full of allegations about fake news from everybody. And there's a risk, I think, from what Martin said, of that continuing post Article 50 notification, which we understand is going to be next week. So I think that's an important issue. And the other concern I have about a different conflict of interest is representing London to government as editor of the New Standard, at the same time being a Northern MP, where the North has very different interests from government compared to London. And that, I think, I mean, personally, having been an MP, I don't see how you could possibly do both jobs properly either anyway. I mean, it was a full-time job as far as I was concerned, in fact, more than full-time. So, you know, but whether or not he's representing his constituents in the North properly is a matter for them. But I am concerned there's a potential conflict of interest. So if he's not standing up for London, say, is that because he's got his eye over his shoulder? to the interests of his constituency up north, or is it for legitimate reasons, which is sort of developing your argument, Martin, about where's the Standard going and double guessing, second guessing Standard stories.
I think that's the danger, is that people are going to be needing to look at the Standard and constantly assess what is the motivation for this story. Now, you might say we should always question the motivation for stories wherever they appear, and maybe that's true, but most people read news in a fairly passive sense, and yet to fully understand why the Standard is running into individual story when a sitting of... If we were talking about somebody who was standing down at the next election and you were 8 or 12 months away, you might say, fair enough, it's perfectly fine for them to remain in post, we don't want to incur the cost of a by-election. If you were looking at somebody who'd previously been an MP, if you were looking at Tessa Jowell or Michael Patillo, people who have largely stepped beyond partisan politics and bring extra experience in, you might say, again, fair enough, they've got a known political viewpoint, but they can't directly benefit from any individual story. But when you're a putative leadership candidate, when you're somebody who would like to be back in cabinet, you clearly have a horse in every race that the paper's going to cover. And I think that it's undeniable that it will impact on how people read Standard and interpret news. It chips away at the credibility, and I think that's a bad thing for London, because the paper is a good paper with some fantastic journalists in there, and they're going to be undermined every single day. And what happens when it's a story about, let's say the government brings forward plans to further cut housing benefit. The editor votes for the proposal. Does the editor get named and shamed on the front page, or does he magically get left out of the list of MPs who vote against? These are the decisions that journalists inside the paper are going to have to make. And why are those decisions? There's no transparency about why that decision's being made.
Okay, I'm going to bring Hannah in now because she's indicated she'd like to.
Thank you.
add to this.
In terms of covering local news, which is what we do, I edit the South London Press and happen to own it as well, the South London Press, London Weekly News, Mercury newspapers. So we cover kind of half of London. I think the Evening Standard is a fantastic newspaper, but I'm not going to talk too much about George Osborne because I kind of agree with kind of most of what's already been said. But talking about local news provision, I've always thought that as a local newspaper we should be independent and offer a fair and balanced coverage in our newspapers, and let readers make up their own minds. Now, South London Press has had a few owners. I've been editing it for the last 17 and a bit years, and in that time we've been owned by a couple of companies. And our job is to cover the main boroughs, Lambeth, Lewisham, Southwark, Merton, in as fair and balanced way as possible. It has become, without a doubt, like most local newspapers, and it's been a struggle over the last few years, and for a number of reasons. It's always been making sure that we cover the ground thoroughly has always been a struggle, making sure our reporters are at the right council meetings, scrutinising public authorities, making sure we're out and about at the right public meetings, coverage of libraries, all of these local issues that are really important to our readers. And I keep going back to how we serve our readers. That's the very most important thing, our readers. Our staff are important, but we've got to always, our first priority is our readers. And we've always been looking at tightening up resources. When I joined the South London Press 17 years ago, we were in a meeting and I was told plan for decline, because that's where we were in local news. Today, we're still out there covering, and we've got fantastic advertising department bringing in revenue. But I think it's a real problem for local newspapers now, because it's obviously fast-tracked in changes in social media, and a lot of us have kind of lost our way and not had a great sense of direction in terms of what we're doing, but we've still got some very precious local newspapers and titles, that South London Press 1865, Mercury 1833, very much part of their communities, very much part of the wealth and richness. And I'm quite lucky because I get to go out and about a lot. So I go into schools, I talk to Streatham Society, whichever, I try and get out as much as I can, and people love their local newspapers, but we're being stretched further and further. And that's no fault of anyone's, actually. It's just changing times. So I think it's just how we broaden our approach and try and get more people looking at more newspapers. Evening Standard's a great paper, but I would hope that people have a choice and continue to have a choice of what they read, and that they can make their own opinion and make up their own minds about issues. And I think the way is independence. I would rather be part of a group and a newspaper that is independent. Politics, you shouldn't know what party if we support any party, a reader shouldn't be able to tell that. But of course we need local newspapers to stand up for people. So an Evening Standard has run a great campaign on homelessness and other campaigns, and we've also run campaigns, and we've got to be strong enough to shout out for our readers on all of these really important issues, and now more than ever. And that's what concerns me, and that's what concerns me when I talk to my kids and I say, who's going to speak out for you when you've got a problem with your housing? You know, who's going to tell the story about your school? So I think we should kind of refocus on looking at how we're actually going to help engage people back into local news. And social media is fantastic. We need to be using that a lot more. But how do we get people interested? Because I know people are, that we have tight-knit communities across South London, but we've got to get people re-engaged back so they can play a part in their community and making a difference. And I think that's part of the role of a local newspaper, to help people do that. Anyway.
Thank you. I think that's sort of drawn us back to local newspapers and the sort of role of...
talking about. Thank you.
Kemi,
But it is the local newspaper for London.
it is a London newspaper.
It is.
Kemi, we are not reopening
the funny
this
thing is, I actually
discussion.
agree with everything that
Kemi.
Martin said, even Andrew. It is just not within the remit of this committee to
Kemi,
decide who a
it
private
is.
company should pick
Kemi.
as its editor.
Kemi,
and
could
the
you just...
idea that we're going to invite
Kemi,
them in and ask them to sack him.
but we
You know,
haven't...
Let's move on. Let's move on. We're not going to agree to disagree. It's disappointing that we had a conversation
Kemi,
and
could
you chose to do something else in the meeting, but let's move on. Let's move on. Let's move on. We're wasting time. We spent 25 minutes on this. Let's move on. We're wasting time.
Well, you're the ones wasting time.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not.
Ridiculous.
Yeah, can we just move on from this?
Yes,
I
thank
was very grateful to Hannah for bringing it back to sort of local newspapers and the role local newspapers play in communities. One of the things we are interested in, and actually the point was made about cuts at the Standard as well, so I think this is an issue for all printed media at the moment. I mean, if you just look at newspapers like The Guardian, so there is a broader issue around news provision. And I just wondered whether guests could comment on how the landscape of local newspapers across the UK has changed in the last decade, and Hannah set the scene very nicely, but what the picture's been like in London, and also maybe comment a bit on what factors have driven this change. I've got Kerry and then I've got Eric.
Okay, so a lot of the information in the briefing notes and a lot of the discussion so far has used the word newspapers. I'm from Trinity Mirror. I've been in Trinity Mirror all my career. I started off at my local weekly, which is the best start in journalism, because if you report on the local Amdram, then you have to go to the pub and see them. You know, you need to choose your words carefully, and it really is the best drill ever in valuing your words. Where the Trinity Mirror way of looking at it is that we look at news brands. So when I restructured the South East, when I moved from Wales last year, it's all the editors are called brands editors. And the strategy is that you grow the key brands, and that is all down to what Hannah talks about, because we need to engage the audience. And this isn't something that we're doing that is trailblazing. We are following our audience. So the disruption to our industry has happened because our audience is digesting news elsewhere. And what we are trying to do, albeit belatedly in some cases, is follow that audience and engage with them. And that's really important. The challenge is that increasingly our readers are brand blind, that they don't really mind where they get their news from. So it's our duty to tell the most important stories that are very local in the most engaging ways, and that is using all the skills on our behalf that we have across all our platforms. So print is very important. Print is extremely challenged, but there's a lot of life left in print. But we have to be engaging with our audience where they are. We have to be telling the stories that they want to read when they need to read them. and we were lucky enough to be able to do that with very skilled, multi-skilled teams across the sort of southeast and London and in Croydon as well. So it's newspapers are a part of the picture. It's the news brands that will be delivering and safeguarding local journalism for as long as we need it, forever.
Thank you. I've got Eric, Andrew and Laura who've indicated in that order. So Eric, if you could comment.
I don't want to hear at the outset being too contentious, but in view of the fact that Osborne's appointment was brought up today, what's wrong with the appointment and the newspaper is the fact that it leaves London without a choice. So what in effect you have is a monopoly form of journalism which is to be abhorred and not to be in any way applauded. The politics of Mr. Osborne are less important than the fact that you have this monopoly in journalism. I helped to found the Camden New Journal in 1982, so it does go back more than a decade to look at the decline in journalism, both national and local. You really have to go back to more than 35 or more years. If you do, you will see there's been a steady decline in advertising revenue, which has become speeded up in the past 5 to 8 years since the crash of 2007. And this has forced companies to either shut titles, cut staff, or disappear, or to indulge in make-believe journalism or make-believe ownership, all of which, if you were to look at newspapers, you would begin to see what I mean. We founded the Camden New Journal as a commonly owned ownership. There are only 2 such newspapers in the United Kingdom. There are roughly about 1,500 weekly papers in the UK, and there are two out of 1,500. Unlike the continent, where you find a higher degree of cooperatives in ownership of companies, including newspapers, there's a really successful one in Berlin. In England, it's been shunned. So you have 2 in the whole of the United Kingdom, ourselves, the Camden New Journal, and the valiant West Highland Free Press, a Scottish paper, founded in the 1970s, partly by Brian Wilson. So there are only 2 commonly owned, and only these 2, in fact, means that this is something that local government, the government and local government agencies should look at when they place advertising. I do not believe in any form of state subsidised control or influence of newspapers, not at all. But I think you can help by placing adverts in such a manner that they go to the best sort of newspapers. We actually have this umbilical cord connecting ourselves to our readers. So if you look at the Camden New Journal, you can see at a glance that it has reader empowerment. We have 4 pages of letters. Show me one weekly newspaper in London which has so many letters sent by readers. We circulate 42,000 copies of the newspaper, and we have this close living relationship with our readers, which is quite unique, but which is what you would expect of a commonly owned company. You would expect no less, in fact. And I think you can look at a newspaper and judge, is it really being read, not by journalists who make a living by looking at newspapers, but by readers. Is it really being read by them? And you can look at the letters pages and see at a glance whether it is. You don't need to be an expert on journalism to see all that. So, as far as the Camden New Journal is concerned, I admire the paper like the South London Press as it used to be. I knew it when it had a circulation of 30-odd thousand. What you find now with London weeklies is that their circulation has plummeted to really a few thousand.
I think if I can interrupt you and bring Angela in, and then Laura and Sean wanted to ask a follow-up, that there should be an opportunity to come in a bit later, but we're keen to get the views from the whole panel. So Angela and Laura, and given the number of people, if people can be quite concise, and we'll try and be concise with our questioning as well.
Okay, I mean, I think what I want to... It's important to actually diagnose the problem very clearly, and I think people tend not to look at it in an international perspective. If you look at the American local press, the British local press and the Irish local press, they have common problems in that they were all over-leveraged at the end of the 90s, so they ended up at the end of the 90s just at the moment when everything began to plummet, with huge debts. And they were over-leveraged with huge debts because they were making so much money. Even though their circulations were dropping, they still had a monopoly of local advertising, and they were making huge amounts of money. So this constant buying and selling meant that the debts went up. And then along came the internet and Google, in particular, and local advertising. Google's able to target advertising to individuals, so that the advertising, the funding base of the local press just plummeted. Now, the problem with a lot of our press in this country is that it's owned by chains, big chains, who are mainly responsible to their shareholders. And you have a situation where the press made decisions that were all about keeping their profit margins up. And that meant that the only way they could do that was to sack staff. That meant that the quality began to plummet, and it wasn't terribly good. I think I would say it wasn't as good as perhaps somewhere else in other places in the world, even at that point. But without journalists, I mean, newspapers are very, very expensive things to produce because they depend on human beings who need to eat and they need somewhere to live. So rather like the National Health Service, actually producing a news service is an extremely expensive enterprise if you're going to do it properly. Well, the way forward, unfortunately, for the big chains has been to cut, so that we end up with chains across South London with practically no journalists, and I'm sure that Laura will be picking this up, because if you start reducing the quality of your product, you will lose your audience. And if you lose your audience, you go into an immediate death spiral. And there's no way that even, the best one in the world, with what's happening in the Mirror, that you're going to be able to put that back with digital. Because we know that digital is simply not delivering in terms of income. And we know that the balance, I mean, most organisations that have both digital and print are completely dependent on their print product to actually pay for their digital product. Digital product may bring in lots of clicks, but as we're beginning to understand, as a lot of the stuff in the press at the moment about programmatic advertising, advertising online is basically a way of creaming off profits and sending it to Google, Facebook, and the other platforms. The news industry has totally failed as an industry to find a new revenue stream. This is not a failure of journalism, which it is often described as being. It is a business failure. It is a failure of technology. And yes, there probably are ways of solving it, but we're nowhere near finding them.
Okay, I think that's helpful. I've got a huge number of people who've indicated they want to come in, and 2 assembly members who've indicated they want to ask questions. And I think it's probably partly in response to your comments, Angela. We've got, which is helpful to sort of prompt the debate. We've got Laura, Hannah, Martin and Kerry have indicated, and my colleagues Sean and Joanne. So was there anything you wanted to ask specifically on points that had come up so far, or, yeah?
I just want to ask something about brand and how you monetize that brand, and also to your point about failure. I'm a youth worker, I work with young people, and I don't think they ever knew about newspapers in a way that maybe slightly older people do. And is there a connection there? Is there a connection between how you build the brand, monetize the brand, and inform them about papers? Because my generation, and certainly generation back, will not pay for anything online. We don't pay for things online. If it's online, we expect it to be free.
Other places in the world are beginning to do so. We just give up. We give up. We don't look anywhere else. We are almost the least likely to pay for news online, but in other countries they do.
Should we take the two, because Joe wanted to make a point and then Caroline, why don't we take these 3 points and then people can address them all in?
I wanted to get through about coverage in London, because we've seen the number of titles go down, but also the circulation has reduced. I know in my local area, for example, some postcodes no longer get their local paper delivered. I mean, I moved house last year, and I went from one postcode where I didn't get it delivered to one where, like I said, I now get my local news. And is that advertiser driven? And is it the case that there's parts of London, even where there is a paper in the borough, that certain communities will just not get a local paper?
Is your question related to that as well, is it?
No, Mike, I was just thinking that part of what Sean was asking would actually come up in the questions that I'll be asking later.
Oh,
so
apologies.
In terms
Okay.
of older people.
Right, okay. So maybe the point about advertising revenue and how that drives
Well,
it
it's
then.
directed to different postcodes, so some
Yeah.
communities may not actually get it anymore.
Yeah, so Angela's described very clearly an industry that has been totally disrupted, and it's been disrupted by the audience moving and digesting news in a different way. However, unlike Angela, who foresees a doomsday scenario where there's no answer, the Trinity Mirror approach is different to that. We believe in growth. Our strategy is to grow our audience online, and to couple that very successful audience growth online to match that with our digital revenue, so that we reach a point where the digital revenue outweighs the print decline. If we simply talk about newspapers, we will be talking about permanent decline. I mean, it is. If we're talking about, Sean, your question about engaging the next generation, my children, for example, they're on tablets, they're digital natives. So everything that we need to be preparing our news brands to be essential reading for the people who are now on our phones. It's not us, and we cannot survive just on the print brands. It is a disrupted industry, as Andrew describes. In terms of audience, though, the picture is actually very, very rosy. In terms of audience for Croydon Advertiser and for the Get West London titles, which are Axbridge and Ealing and Fulham, we've got an audience now that we haven't had since the early 1970s. So this is not a time for total hand-wringing, and I would be very combative to anyone who would suggest that that is built upon poor journalism or a standard of journalism that is below par. The Croydon Advertiser, for example, if we do a snapshot of that, it excelled during the recent tram coverage, the tram disaster, and it was able to do so because we'd moved the newsroom, so it was digital first. So on the day of that happened, we published 47 stories. We were on Facebook. Our Facebook likes increased on that day by 1,700. In terms of engaging people and being relevant and local and essential, which is what our growth is based on, that's an eloquent answer. We published 130 stories on it that week. And the key thing that sets us apart is that we don't then go away. So we're still there. We were invited to the funerals. No other big media did. It was the day of Trump's inauguration. Very few other media interests were interested in from the beginning. We started at 6. We went on through the night. So our growth is based on that type of journalism. Nothing grows journalism, our audience, stronger than relevant news done brilliantly, delivered to readers where they now expect it. And that isn't, I'm afraid, waiting until the Croydon Advertiser comes out on a Thursday. Our coverage in print was brilliant, but it was all fed by everything we had done from the moment we heard of the terrible event. So it's not a gloomy story. We are back in the audience figures of the 1970s. Our reporters are multi-skilled and thriving.
Okay, I'm going to bring Laura in, and then I'm going to move on to the next area of questioning. So if people have got points...
Something about advertising.
Yeah, just very briefly,
Yeah.
thanks.
Angela made the point about Google advertising and it not feeding, revenue not feeding through to newspapers. But when I click on to the online edition of the local newspapers in my area, there's advertising in the print as you turn the pages over. Who gets that money from that advertising?
Can I just
Presumably it stays with the paper, but is that money
I think
tied?
Hannah's wanting to answer this. Yeah.
Do you mind if I just answer the question about advertising? And I agree with everything Angela said and everything Kerry said. I don't think it's a gloomy picture. At South London Press, we kind of sit between Eric and Trinity Mirror, and Trinity Mirror have got fantastic people and resource, and I know that they'll develop the social media and perfectly. We're a much smaller business. So I see our local newspaper business pretty much as it started in 1865 by one man. And it's a local family newspaper business that needs money, it needs cash flow, it needs money coming in and out. And Angela is absolutely correct in that newspapers is a really expensive business. Now I'm now dealing with all the commercial side. I'm not a commercial person, I'm an editorial. 14 years old, I've been in newsrooms, so I'm an editorial person. But I understand the business like the back of my hand. And newspapers is a very expensive business, so we deal with print, and paper prices have gone up 8% last year, another 8% after Brexit. So paper's gone up, hasn't helped. And distribution, we use Johnston presses, fantastic state-of-the-art presses, various distribution companies to get our papers out, some door-to-door. We do various ways of distributing our newspapers. Some are free, some are pick-up, some are paid for. So it's a mix with the South London Press. Some of it's paid for, some of it's pick-up. So we have various models. Really expensive to do. There is no cheap way. This is a hugely expensive business. It's not like we don't rely on any kind of natural materials. We're not in a coffee shop. We can use hot water. It's all expensive, right? And we rely on talent. We rely on journalism. We rely on fantastic ad reps. We rely on production people, all right the way through to the people putting the bills out in the street. And our problem is, it's moved, and people expect, and it was our fault, people expect their news for free. So my kids, just like Kerry's kids and most probably everybody else's, are on their tablets. They're not going to, they want it for free. They want it instantly, and they want it free. And then, of course, we've still got wonderful readership, fantastic, precious readership. And they are there, and they are, they're dwindling, but they're still here, who want the papers, and as do the advertisers. But it's the balance is we have to find between the newsprint and the social media. We have websites, we do Twitter, Facebook, etc., but it's not bringing in the revenue. For us, it's not going to pay for a journalist. It's not going to pay for anyone's job. I have got figures, I'm not going to tell them, but the amount that our website raised last year to contribute to our business was minor in comparison to the advertising that we put on the pages. But again, that's very expensive all the way through. So we're constantly looking at, and I hear the accountants say, is there anybody in your business not contributing to revenue? Well, in theory, journalists aren't going out and selling the revenue, but people aren't going to buy the newspaper unless there's something really great in it and we're covering local community news. So it is a very expensive business. So your answer to why your newspaper probably came through your door a few years ago and perhaps doesn't come through now or you've moved is because that's the first area you look at, is you look at distribution, you look at your print copies, you look at where you're targeting, and then you're trying to work out where is your audience. And for us, supermarket pickups, dare I say, I know it's like bread and butter housekeeping, 100% pickup. People love. So I know people love the papers in terms of they pick it up. But to get people now, and it's really hard, and this is a challenge, to pay for it is hard. Our newspaper's only 50p. It hasn't gone up for 10, 12 years. That's the price. But online, people expect it for free, and that is our huge challenge. And I don't think we're going to beat, personally, the online. I think that's up to people like Trinity. I mean, far better and greater resource than we have. But in terms of covering local news in London, it is a mixture for us, and it's all kinds of models, paid for, pickups, social media, website, but it's a combination. But Angela's absolutely right. That's where we've gone wrong. We thought there was money in websites, and there isn't yet news as much to keep our businesses going, because newspapers have built these empires. You know, I inherited a business over 1.5 years ago that was quite heavy, really. It's quite an expensive business to run, because we have experienced good people. And as Angela says, in London particularly, they're having to live and pay rent and huge mortgages. And so it's not, it doesn't compare. I mean, the salaries are not fantastic salaries, but you have to pay the rate where people can live for the experience they have and the education. So it is a battle. So I see it as a small business, and we will survive. We will absolutely survive. We will absolutely get through. But it's just looking, and I've spoken to lots of independents in the last year, independent groups, small groups, not the Johnstons, the Trinities, the Newsquests, but the small independents, and there's still quite a few of them in our country, still quite a few, and they're all looking at alternative ways of raising revenue, because they are absolutely committed that newspapers will get through, newsprint will get through, and serving the community in the way that we do will get through, but we do have to look at alternative ways of raising money and be open-minded about that.
Thank you. That's helpful. Laura's been very patiently waiting, indicated some time ago. So I'm going to ask a comment from you, Laura, and then apologies to anybody else who's indicated, but we'll then move on to the next area of questioning. Laura.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I support what a lot of Hannah was saying there, actually, and pleased to kind of hear her recognising the importance of the journalists and the people who actually produce the content that the paper can then go out and sell to people. And I really welcome the opportunity to speak to the committee today about these issues. It's very timely for the NUJ because we're launching a campaign later this week called Local News Matters, which is absolutely focusing on the pressures that the local press is under and the importance of the work that journalists do. It is disappointing, I think, not to see NewsQuest here today as part of the panel, because this session has arisen specifically out of motions that were passed by the Assembly about cuts to journalism in South London. And just to give the panel, so the committee, some examples, actually since the last motion was passed by the Assembly, the picture has got worse in those titles in South London. And by the end of this month, because of vacancies on those titles, there'll be just 7 reporters covering the South London boroughs. And that compares to where the company said that 12 were needed in the summer of last year, and where a year ago there were 22. So there's a really massive dent in the numbers of journalists who will be producing those titles, and it's difficult to, it's not a sustainable situation. And that picture actually is replicated in many parts of the capital, where we've seen over the last few years that drastic reduction in staff numbers. Your briefing paper talks about there being new titles that have launched, and that is true, but I think it masks the real story that behind that there's been a significant reduction in the numbers of journalists who are producing those titles, and they're taking on additional kinds of work, so the social media work that we've been talking about, using new tools, video, for example, and so on. And at the same time, we've seen specialist roles being cut. So, for example, staff photographers have been reduced, and specialist reporting roles have been reduced. Subs have been cut and merged into hubs, which haven't proved to have worked either. So the picture in terms of from the journalist point of view is really one of being overstretched in trying to, out of goodwill and love of journalism, trying to plug these gaps where they've emerged. So, we've seen staff who have experienced stress and been unwell as a result of the pressures that they're facing at work. And at the same time, as Hannah alluded to, they're struggling because pay is low, and the costs of living in the capital are high. And as you'll know, we've seen journalists who've had to go on strike in order to be able to achieve the London living wage, in order to be able to try to live and continue to do these very important jobs in the capital. And just to pick up on the point that Kerry was making about brands, I mean, brands don't exist in isolation. They exist because of the people on the ground who produce the material. And I think there is a risk that if you aggressively cut these roles, you actually damage the brands and you turn readers away, and it's quite difficult then to bring them back. And so that's something I think that needs to be considered.
Thank you. I think that's an area that probably come up in the next area of questioning, which is over to you, Kemi.
Thank you. So I'm continuing on the theme of the decline of local newspapers, and the questions I have are related to the consolidation of newspaper ownership, investment and business decisions, which is something that Angela talked about, and then on demand for local news, and finally on competition, where I want to talk about the distribution issue in London specifically. So my first question about consolidation of newspaper ownership. I mean, national newspapers all seem to be big companies or very wealthy people supporting them. And this is happening regionally. Have there been any advantages that have come out of it, economies of scale, where there has actually been a business benefit to the consolidation for local news? Not just in London, but elsewhere. Laura?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. I mean, it's an area of concern because actually if you look at what's happened in terms of consolidation, what's happened on the back of that is that we've seen further reductions actually in staffing numbers. There's been research carried out in the last year or so which has looked at choice and plurality across the country for readers. And in London specifically, of the 32 boroughs that there are served by a local newspaper, there are 20 local authority districts with a publisher that has a greater than 70% share of the market, and 13 have a monopoly publisher, so just one publisher. And that's a reduction in choice for readers, which goes to some of the points I think that we were making at the start of the session. And one of the concerns that we've been raising is the fact that, as it stands, if a company announces that they're closing a title, there is no opportunity for others to come forward and say, actually, we want to look at this. Can we take this on? Can we look at alternative ways of running it? The title is shut down, locked away, and nobody can access it. So one of the things that we've been arguing and campaigning for is for local newspaper titles to be designated as community assets, which would mean there would be time for local communities to do something about that and to try and see if they could come forward with proposals to retain the titles and protect them so that there aren't these losses that we're seeing. And I think we're really concerned that there's a real risk that there will be other titles that go, which is why this inquiry is so important.
Can I stop you there? Because that links quite well with the question on demand, about demand. Because in London specifically, a lot of our news is covered in national newspapers. I'm on Police and Crime Committee, for example, and a lot of the news about police is really London police, to the extent that many people think the Met is the national police. Do you feel, and Helen Carey, I'd like you to sort of chip in, do you feel that the demand for local news in London has dropped, that people just feel it's already covered elsewhere, so they don't need a separate local newspaper?
I working in my newsroom, and judging by the number of calls we get from local people wanting to either give us stories or ring up and have an issue with some service or they've got something, and whatever their issue is. No, I mean, we're still busy in terms of the number of calls we get. We've still got a very loyal readership who keep in regular contact. And so from a work perspective, no, I think people still come to us and consider it a joy, actually, to have their story published in the newspaper, whether it's an issue about policing, schools, education, a lot of changes in education at the moment, a lot of changes in health. We still run campaigns, and we are still able to we had a mental health campaign, we're still able to, just recently, we're still able to bring a lot of people together. So I think in London particularly, and only because that's where I live, this is where I live and work, The communities are very tight-knit, and people are very interested in what's happening on their doorstep. More so, I think, now than ever, when with us, I mentioned earlier, library closures, now changes in education. I think there is a huge demand for news on people's doorstep, absolutely. I think people are more as proactive as ever. It is a different story for the younger generation. You know, they have a kind of slightly different focus. But I do go into a lot of schools, and they are interested as well. They're taught, they have citizenship classes in school. Like, you know, our kids have citizenship classes. They're taught to play a part in their community. So they're going to need a voice, and their voice is a local newspaper. So I think there is, as ever, and as much interest.
And that's not for certain parts of London. Do you think that there's maybe this area has a more close-knit community, and other areas people are more transient,
I
or
think
just
South
feel they're part of a
Londoners
bigger London?
I think we're a very special breed, South Londoners, and I do think we're very close-knit, and I do think South London's particularly vocal. And I mean, obviously, Eric will speak about Camden and a different area, but I think there is definitely a need and an interest in news from people's doorsteps.
Okay. So just before I bring you in, because I have some numbers here about newspapers that are launched. I've always lived in South London, so I've always seen South London Press. Thank you. I've always seen South London Press, and I wanted to clarify. When I see new titles being launched, like Brixton and South London Press, is this a genuine launch with a new audience, or is it just a rebrand?
That was actually a product when we were part of we were part of Trinity, then we were part of Tyndall, and the Tyndall newspapers, big newspaper group, very successful, very hyper local, great belief in hyper local, and so under Tyndall we did launch Deptford edition, a Brixton edition. Forest Hill edition, etc. And the idea behind that was that we would have more hyper-local newspapers, and they weren't all change pages. We had a few, I think 3 change pages, 1, 2 and 3. But that model, it got a little bit confusing to our readers, and we kind of, it did get confusing, so we had to really refocus it back onto South London. South London's a hard area, like London generally. It's not like covering one small village. You know, we've got about 11 to 13 MPs, we have huge numbers of councillors, we cover big councils like Lambeth and Southwark, so it is a vast area to cover, and it's a very strange, it's not like covering one town. So we have to try, maybe we've spread ourselves too thinly, we're trying to be all things to all people.
But there was no new audience with those rebrands, was there?
I think Joe's coming on to hyperlocals in a bit, so just...
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
Well, the news is still being covered, but it's gone within the paper, because we should be covering all of those areas anyway. Brixton, very important area for us, so it's all in there, but it's just doesn't have its own front page.
Thank you.
Okay, so Kevin, you asked about the demand for news and whether there's an appetite there for it. So to give you an example that's backed up with statistics, we launched the Get West London app in October, so please download it. And it's actually done brilliantly. So we launched it and it was 1,000 page views a day, and now it's 15,000+ page views a day. And more better than that really is that once you have the app on your phone, the local person reads 13 pages every day, whereas if you go onto your desktop, it's 1 or 2, and that's key to us being an essential part of everyone's everyday lives in those areas. So I think that demonstrates A, there's an appetite, and B, that we can be where people need us when they need us. Also, our best performing stories, and by best performing that means best read. I hate the use of the click, as if click doesn't mean anything other than someone has read your story. So, you get an extra click, or you mean you want someone to read another one of the stories that you bothered to write. So if we could use that vocabulary, that would be very helpful and more respectful to my colleagues. So that's really really important, that uptake, and all those stories are about crime, and we cover that live. There are police appeals for missing boys, and then also transport and travel, which is so much a part of everyone's everyday life in London. So yes, the demand is there, and I think that we're serving it.
Okay.
And can I just say, it's just not, it is the demand, but it's also local newspapers. We do tell stories and we tell people stories, but people have always come to us because they want us to help them in an issue they have. And sometimes it's not a story. And I think what people don't see in our newsroom, I mean, I still get calls from people who just need a bit of help with whether it's housing. It usually is housing in our area, actually. And they just want someone to put in a phone call to the local authority. So local newspapers have always had a great deal of influence in ringing someone up or ringing the MP up and saying, look, what do you think this, off the record, what do you think about this? Is there anything you can do? So our job is to get the stories in the newspaper, but there's a greater social role that local newspapers have always had.
Yes, I think Hannah's quite right. There is a certain amount of social work, you can almost say, local newspapers do. But before I go, I really do want to emphasise that if you have a commonly owned newspaper, the rate of profit, which is most important, can be kept low and you can still survive. If you are snapped at the heels by shareholders and so on, they will understandably want high dividends, but you don't need, you can survive on a lower net return. And it's quite important that this is seen by your colleagues.
It's important that we make a profit though, because we invest. Part of Trinity Mirror does is that we invest massively in the training of our journalism, whether that's legal training, whether it's IPSO training, social media. We've now invested in video, which is where there's more revenue. So there is, we don't make profit for profit's sake, that it is invested in our journalists, and especially in those skill sets.
Does Andrew want to come in quickly before I go
Just
on?
a quick one to Eric, following on what Laura said about assets of community value when a paper closes down. Is one way that can be taken up the funding model that Eric described for the CNJ, because if it is going to be an asset of community value, then presumably it would be taken over on a not-for-profit basis by a local community, and Eric's model would probably suit that.
Yeah, I'm quite keen on that. I have this peculiar belief that it's the reader who should be the owner of the newspaper. I know it's not looked upon by other people in that manner, but I really do believe that. So yes, I mean, I've no objection at all. And this particular Berlin daily newspaper has a reader club association, which is what we need and will start on the Camden New Journal, so that the readers play a part. They don't edit the paper, that would be impossible, but they play a part in the ethos of the paper.
That brings us very nicely to my next question about competition. And I'm going to ask about the distribution of newspapers and what we can do about that specifically for London, because that is a monopoly situation at the moment. But why is it that no other people have come in with alternatives? If you feel that NewsQuest or whoever is not doing a good enough job and the quality is going down, it is easier than ever to publish online. Why have we not seen lots of...
Not easy.
Because it's very expensive to start a newspaper.
No, I say this because the reason why I'm asking this question is because I come from a slight media background. Just before I was working here, I was part of the management team of Spectator and looking at the commercial side, not editorial. And this is one of the issues that we dealt with a lot. So I have a good...
So we are going to go to blogging with Joanne's question.
Is that coming in? Really? Okay. I didn't think so. I thought it was slightly different because blogging I tend to think of as niche, singular topics, whereas regional newspapers cover a whole breadth of issues. Do you disagree, Martin?
I would think that setting up a wholly online newspaper from scratch without any kind of pedigree.
Not from scratch, but the journalists who work there, why have they not sort of left to start off their own thing? Not like just random people setting up something.
But in terms of a brand, it would be coming from scratch. And unless you had a particularly well-known or celebrated local journalist who left in a well-publicised for things, or like, I'm going to go off and do my thing, you're already competing with Herd for small amounts of advertising revenue. And then what is it different that you're going to add that's going to bring people to you that the established papers aren't going to be able to either already be doing or copy quite quickly to kill off your chances? I mean, you're looking at establishing a new brand, establishing your credibility, drawing in enough money to pay your upfront costs, and sustain. It's quite a big ask. I think it's a, you know, unless you just won the lottery or you had a deep-pocketed financial backer, I don't see the path where you would do that. I mean, in a
I'm not
publication you
saying
work
it
for
would.
was a
I'm not saying it
historic
would be
title.
easy, but it sounds like from what Laura's saying and so on that there's a gap somewhere that could
Well,
be
let's
filled.
look internationally again. There is no examples, actually anywhere, of newspapers simply springing up online and being financially viable. The people are constantly researching this and trying to find those little golden, shiny examples of where it's actually been possible. Because the reality is that if you've got Trinity Mirror behind you, this is this huge infrastructure, a huge business infrastructure, which collects advertising. If you are 2 or 3 journalists in a local area who think this is a jolly good idea, you've got to build that from scratch and you have no knowledge at all. And what you then have to do is you have to pay for somebody who understands the business and advertising side of it, and you'll have to pay for them at the rate for the job, and you'll have to have people who are really experienced, and then you'll have to have people, coders, and by the time you get around to paying for the journalism, how do you do that? I mean, the only way it could be done would be sort of the ideas that Eric Gordon has come up with. It might be possible for a kind of critical mass of communally run small local newspapers to create an infrastructure between them. But that would be very expensive to do, and you need a completely different expertise. I mean, Hannah is in this situation. She's a journalist, and now she's had to learn how to be a manager, and that's what's happened in journalism by and large. But actually, you need completely different skill sets to build something big enough to sustain journalism, which is in itself expensive.
Okay.
Huffington Post and BuzzFeed, they do very well. Huffington Post and BuzzFeed, they set up from nothing. They make an enormous amount of
Huffington
money
Post, well,
out of
BuzzFeed
journalism.
set up as an entire clickbait organisation. It's not that now, I'll give it that.
But
that's
News is, yeah.
BuzzFeed started off entirely by gaming Google, by actually getting everything through gaming Google, through using
Sorry, just to keep because I know the others have similar questions on this area. I'm not trying to cover it all.
Just to say, in relation to that point, I mean, there are examples of alternative types of models that are working. Both, there are different examples in London, but in other cities like Bristol, for example, there are other models that journalists have set up and, are trying to make things work, and in some cases are proving quite successful. So I think there is an opportunity actually for coming out of this inquiry and for the committee to look at this in more detail and see what can be done to look at some kind of economic stimulus package or some kind of support to organisations that are trying to set up in this way to support them in doing that and to see what can bloom from that.
Okay.
I think Eric, you got a loan from the LGLC, didn't you, to get going?
No, we started with a loan by Midland Bank, the predecessor of HSBC. It was a loan guaranteed by the government, and that's how we started.
So somebody else guaranteed the loan for you?
Yes, the government did, in fact, oddly enough, for me.
So I do want to talk about the distribution, because that's something that is really important. The relationship between TfL, Metro and Evening Standard and other newspapers. I actually personally don't understand why this is the case and whether anyone else can shed some light on how it has come to be and if there's anything that... I think there is stuff that we could probably do about that, but how has it come to be? Anyone? No, so no one knows.
Standard was at a crossroads, wasn't it? It had a decline in readership in common with the industry at the time, and they made a very bold and brave move to turn it free. And at the time, nobody knew whether it would work or not, and actually it's been phenomenally successful. I don't know the intricacies of how they negotiated the deal, but they took a brave step forward at a time when nobody else was prepared to do it, and I think they've proved very successful, and online they're doing well as well.
And they're all, in terms of distribution, they're all the major outlets. It's not just the train stations, they're in council buildings. I don't know if you've got a pile here. Do you have buckets here?
I wouldn't be surprised.
You might do you not?
I think staff bring it
Yeah.
here. They don't.
Yeah, it's
bring
quite
it
I mean, again, that's an added expense. And we one example, Southland Press obviously don't print as many copies of the Evening Standard. So to put a few copies of the Evening Standard a few copies of the Southland Press next to the Evening Standard, our papers would disappear in minutes, and the Evening Standard's got huge bundles which also disappear like hotcakes, but they've got the volume, they've got this glorious volume. So, and
So
I've got
would it
no
help,
doubt
for
that we'd be
instance,
picked up like hotcakes in the same way.
Say you had the Brixton and South London Press, just looking at that as an example, by Brixton rail station,
Yes.
which is or something like
Yes.
that. That's something that would okay. I think we can probably explore that as a committee. But something else that's changed is those newspapers used to come through my front door, and now the Newsquest ones in particular, and now they don't. So they were free and they would just be posted through. I never had to look for the Wimbledon Guardian. It came to me, and now it doesn't. So that's another distribution issue that has changed, which to me seems like, well, if the people aren't reading, them, that's why has that happened?
If the question is, do you cut staff or do you cut the cost of distributing? Do you turn it from a door-to-door distribution, which is very expensive, to an active pickup one where you put them in a place and encourage people to pick them up? Then you save costs. So it's better, in many cases, people will change the distribution model rather than go for staff.
The reason why I'm asking is because for me that's an obvious reason for decline. That if it used to come to me and I don't know where to get it
This
from.
is the same question that Joanne had earlier. So I think Joanne's already raised this earlier in the meeting. So I think if we can move on to Andrew.
Sorry, Joanne, I didn't hear. I honestly didn't hear that.
If we can move on to Andrew's area of questioning.
I want to talk about journalism really, rather than business. Well, I suppose they're at the arm length from what we've heard already. And you know, how's the role of probably for Kerry and Hannah in particular? How's the role, and probably Andrew, how's the role of the journalist changed over the years? Are we seeing less investigative journalism and more being fed by press releases from people like me and the other people around this table? Are journalists sufficiently equipped to be able to do the job like they used to be able to do?
What's brilliant about being a journalist now is that you get so much more information about what your readers are reading, when they're reading it, what they read next and what they're sharing. So in order for us to decide on what we cover and how we cover it, we've got so much more information than we ever did before. Eric mentioned that his 4 pages of letters are one indication that he can see that people are responding and engaging, and that's brilliant. But we can almost see it in real time and where people go next. We can also look at a story if it's doing very well and to do more on that, whereas perhaps you would not have the information to enable you to make those decisions. You can then add video to it, you can ask questions, you can turn the reader's responses to those stories into another story, so the engagement is this circular measure. So it's a great time to be a journalist, and you know more about your readers than ever. So in terms of the press releases, they're less likely to be turned around and put up, because we can see that unless there's a great line, unless you have to work very hard to sell that story to the readers, they're not going to be read. So therefore, when you've got fewer resources, you put your resources where the audience is going to be. That doesn't mean that difficult stories or stories that you think are very important that you just disregard. It just means you have to work harder. And working online means you have so many other ways to try and tell that story than sort of 800 words with maybe a chatty headline.
So is what you're saying that journalism has become more reactive rather than proactive in going out and hunting for stories? I mean, are people now more desk-based in front of a computer rather than going out pounding the streets looking for the stories like they used to do?
We have to pick and choose, I think. We don't have as many reporters as we used to have. So it's not as easy to say, right, I'm just going off to this committee meeting or this council, I'm just going to nip down and go and see that person. Because the beauty of a local newspaper is you should be on the ground and you should have an idea. Hopefully you're also living in your community, so you're picking up stories on the way to work, for example, on the bus journey or whatever. But we do have to pick and choose the stories. And investigative journalism, no, we're still able to do that. But we have to be more choosy about it, and I suppose we discuss it a bit more. As Kerry said, we have to make more informed choices about whether it's worth going down that route. I can't afford to lose a reporter for 3 days and not be productive. I need some copy because we've got deadlines and we need to get papers out. But yeah, they're not out and about as much. I know when I was a reporter, I was out all of the time. I hated being in the office, out all the time. But now it is less out of the office, that is true. But there's still a lot going on in evenings that they get to within reason. But yeah, you just pick and choose, I guess. But we can still react to the people who ring up and say, there's something going on here, can you look into it? But in terms of press releases, yeah, contributed copy is important. I don't think it should be a bad word, contributed copy. We welcome reports and stories and colour about people's lives from our readers. People love to see their stories in the papers. People love to see their pictures in the papers. So, and in terms of press releases that you might write or our councils provide, it is true. A lot of my former wonderful reporters, news editors and deputies are working for local councils in PR roles. They've either gone on to nationals or they've gone to PR, so they know what we're after. So it makes that element easier, actually. It makes that, because they kind of know what we're after. But yeah, we pick and choose, but no, it's a balance. It's just making sure we get the right balance. So we're covering our area, doing the investigations that we need to, scrutinising whether it's the issues regarding Millwall, except we're still looking at all of that and the land around that area. So yeah, we don't close any door. We haven't closed any doors. We haven't said, at no point have I had to say, sorry, can't do this.
Yeah. But with the reduction in the number of journalists on local papers, that presumably has meant you have to cut your cloth according to your means, which means presumably you don't have the same personnel who can go out and cover every council committee meeting.
No, we don't. We cover the main council
or every
meetings.
magistrate's court hearing.
Yeah, in terms of coverage, we cover the main council meetings, the full council meetings. We get our reports to the full, but we don't go to all of the council meetings we used to. And I know that there's a project in hand regarding BBC and funding for reporters covering local councils.
We'll come on to that later on.
Which comes later. But yeah, no, you're right. We're not there all the time. And just like courts, we rely on agency copy. But we always have at Southland Press since the day I started. So.
Yeah. The reality is,
journalists cost money. You can't completely divorce the business side, though one would like to, from the more creative journalistic side. The fact is, over the years, there are fewer journalists, and therefore, of course, what you call investigative reporting is now much less done than it used to be years ago. There's little doubt about that. So not much point in being deceptive or pretending that things aren't what they are.
I mean, the other thing I've picked up from local journalism, because you deal with them all the time, and I've been in politics for an awful long time now, is the very rapid turnover now of journalists compared to what it used to be. Mm-hmm. So all the time you're having to re-educate people about who's who and what's what. I mean, Eric, I would have as an exception to that, because your journalistic team has been relatively stable.
We better not talk about it, yeah.
the time that I've been doing with the CNJ the last few years. But certainly if I look at the NewsQuest editions in my area, I mean, it seems to be a different person virtually every week, and sometimes it's a trainee that I'm dealing with.
Always a trainee, I think, as it stands.
If Laura wants to comment on that as well.
I mean, I think that journalists on those titles and elsewhere are very often voting with their feet and taking jobs that are better paid in other organisations, because the pay is very difficult to survive on, and the pressures that they're under in terms of their working life are not what they came into journalism for, and feeling hamstrung in terms of being able to cover the public bodies, courts, for example, and so on, is very frustrating. And, if you're a young person who comes into the job aspiring to be a journalist in all of the ways that it should be, and you find the reality is actually you're in the office, your local office has been shut, and you're in a kind of centralised hub somewhere miles away from the area that you should be covering, you can't get out and about, it's not surprising, actually, that some people are choosing to leave journalism and go on to other jobs. And that's again why this inquiry is so important. How can we change things so that people will be able to stay in these jobs, make it affordable for people to be able to do them and to support them with training and development, and particularly look at the question of diversity, I think, because I think that's something else that has suffered, very much in the industry, and something where the committee could play and the mayor could play an important role in trying to encourage people in and supporting them into those careers and really trying to transform the industry from that point of view.
No, there certainly seems to be a lot of aspiring journalists, judging by the requests I get, and I think we all get from the City University Journalism School about after every assembly meeting asking for interviews and things. I mean, how many of them actually get a job at the end of it that's worthwhile?
Well, and I think they can become burnt out.
We train journalists at Goldsmiths, so and we also run our own local news organisation, which is the East London Line's news website. So one of the things that I'm very conscious of is that practically none of our journalists go to local papers. They love to do work experience there. They would love to work for local newspapers, but they cannot afford to do so. And I think it's not just that, there's also the question of progression. If you want to have young people who are of a really high calibre, who've already got a degree, and probably doing a postgraduate, or they've done a degree with journalism included in it, and you're only offering salaries that make it impossible for them to live independently, the situation is pretty untenable. Our journalists, I would say pretty much all the students who come through Goldsmiths go into jobs in journalism, but they don't go into the local news. They don't go into local news, and that's a real problem for news as a whole, because news is an ecosystem. The national newspapers need the local newspaper because they need to see who's doing. That's where the stories get dug up. National newspapers do not know what's happening in a planning dispute on a housing estate in Hackney. Why would they know? You need local people. You need local journalists to be looking for that and actually seeing where the stories are. But if you're not, if the bottom of the ecosystem is starving, I don't know how we're going to continue in the future to feed it. We're going to get people like George Osborne, who have never been trained as a journalist and are simply using newspapers for propaganda purposes.
No, I mean, basic information is, when I started as a journalist, as a trainee, I started on £9,000, but I'm a Londoner, but I started in Birmingham because I couldn't afford to live in London. So I had to move out of London to be able to do my traineeship in Birmingham, where I stayed on 9,000 for a few years and moved on, because that's what you do, and that's what you would expect young journalists to do after their apprenticeships. You know, they do 2 years and you kind of expect them to move on. 2-3 years you want them to move on. In London it is kind of different. They're on a, trainee starts on around 19,000, and then they probably progress to about 23 and a half, but they are coming to work. And they're seeing a lot of all these other wonderful jobs that are available in PR and other organisations that they start to build their lives, their families, and they need to earn more income. But the people at Southland Press, I'm very lucky because people are fantastic, and I've worked with them for years, most of them for years. And they do it because they're passionate and they love it and they're part of the community. So, but young journalists, you'd kind of expect them to move on, to be fair, after a couple of years, 3 years.
I want to welcome Linda Quinn to the meeting from Brixton Bugle. I know she's been trying very hard to come in on this point for some time. Andrew, do you want to?
Linda, do you wanted to?
Sorry, thank you. When I started in journalism in national papers, which was rather a long time ago now, I probably now do the job of 27 to 30 people. And that's before you take into account social media, if you think about correctors of the press, Slade, compositors, and so on and so forth. Now, the problem, it seems to me, is that youngsters coming into journalism now find it very difficult to do so. I train a local journalist from 3 colleges around the Brixton area, and I'm finding that the kind of diversity of people who want to move into journalism is really narrowing, and that's partly as a result, I think, of what's really rather low pay for a professional job in a London. I think you would find it very difficult to survive on it. But the thing I think that bothers me most is the real potential for a democratic deficit as a result of a lack of local community reporting. And I say that as often the only journalist on a hyper-local to attend full council meetings of Lambeth Council, and indeed often the only person at cabinet meetings and in the planning committee rotation. And I think that's a real problem, because if individuals in the community, the electorate, don't know what's happening in their name, it's very difficult to form a judgment and to hold the council to account, or even to know whether one ought to hold the council to account. So I think one of the real difficulties, and it's been alluded to by others, is the financial model to enable that kind of real local accountability and hyper-local reporting to happen. And I think Eric and others hit upon the fact that digital on its own won't do it, because nobody has as yet found the means to monetize digital alone. With our paper, which is 12,000 circulation, 27,000 Twitter followers, 16,000 on Facebook, the only way we can survive is through sponsorship and advertorial of the printed paper, which I think still has a deeper reach, even though it has less followers than Twitter at the moment. So what we're looking at is becoming a community interest company, and to have our readers as our cooperative supporters as probably the only model, I think, that would allow a local paper to survive.
Thank you. We were planning to come on to hyperlocals later, but I think your point about council meetings brings us quite neatly onto Caroline's area of questioning. So if we can move on to that, that'd be great.
Definitely.
Thank you.
So, yes, sort of picking up from where Andrew started on that issue of local scrutiny, and I absolutely recognise the lack of any journalists in scrutiny meetings on local council meetings. It's there's just no one there, and if the meetings aren't live cast, there's no way for the local paper to know what's happened apart from through what they get told by the press office from the local council. But my first question is about boroughs producing their own newspapers, and whether that is providing competition for local press. And in particular, we've seen I think it's the example of the Hackney Council, who have a publication which takes in about £150,000 of advertising each year. I think they produce it fortnightly. Whether this issue of local authorities producing their own newspapers is a problem for local papers.
I think it's a problem for people's understanding. I mean, we heard it earlier. People read news relatively passively. They don't sit there always interrogating down what is the motive for this. And some of these, particularly previously, some of these papers were dressed up as if they were proper newspapers. Because I say proper news because they're not, are they? They're propaganda rags, really. They're campaigning on the rates in many cases. And this building used to produce one under Ken Evanston, but they are dressed up to look like a newspaper. And people will get this through the door, and it's got a lovely picture of the council leader and no mention of the opposition. And often what you see is those tied to councils and to council press offices which repel actual journalists, which is why, of course, Eric Pickles had to change the law to allow local bloggers, local campaigners and journalists to give them the absolute right to go in and cover meetings. You think about it in London, in this century, for the central government to have to change the law to say people have the right to cover, they have the right to tweet from a meeting, and yet you see, from local journalists I know, local activists that I know, who were threatened with eviction from council chambers because they were daring to tweet what was going on or daring to record what was going on. So you combine that silencing effect with that very one-sided, glossy. And these people don't need to make a return at the end of the day because it's coming out of the council's PR budget, and they're often pet projects by the executive. And so if you combine the effect of the two, then actually they're very damaging for democratic accountability, because what people are getting is a very sugared, polished council propaganda rag, and local journalists and would-be journalists and bloggers and activists and campaigners being excluded, and that produces a very narrow, highly positive spin on what the council's doing, and that's very, very bad. And sometimes in councils where, like yours, you know, you've got very little opposition in the chamber, little
One
political
person.
opposition. Yeah, so that the combined effect of all those three things, you know, major long-term domination by one local party, council rags, and then an aggressive reaction to the media, that's very damaging for accountability. And that, I mean, and this building is the absolute opposite of that. I mean, I think, you know, it's a good chance to say, you know, if any journalist, whatever the scale of the publication that they work for, if they approach the Mayor's press office, you go to the City Hall website, there's a nice big link to the media. There's not just a catch-all press office. You know, there's a separate contact for every single person who works in the Mayor's press office, and for the Assembly's press office. There's a phone number, there's an email address. You can contact Transport for London, you can contact the Met. They always come back to you in a way that some councils won't do, and even national government doesn't do. And in fact, actually, if you're not a recognised newspaper, if you contact a lot of central government departments, as soon as they hear that you're a small publication, online publication, they're interested in helping you. You can hear it audibly disappearing down the other end of the phone. You know, I've contacted, the exception would be the DFT, but possibly because they know of me or they know the publication. But I contacted the Cabinet Office last year, and as soon as, who are you from? Oh, are you know, by some bloke from a website. And that's and you can see the attitude, you can hear it. You know, government press offices are the last place where you don't get put on hold before they speak to a colleague. There's just some bloke from a website wants to know something. I'll tell him we can't help. Or, are you an NUJ member? I am actually. Oh, could you send us through a copy of your NUJ badge or your press badge before you give me an answer? And you get that. That's right. And so if you combine all those approaches, those sort of perceptions of people who are not proper journalists with those council newspapers, then I think what you've got is a really insidious assault on democratic accountability.
Does anyone else want to come in on that?
Well, yeah, because you see, if these publications, which are subsidised by local councils, in fact, you'll find if you look at the ads they publish, they are probably cheaply sold. But of course, because of the economy of scale and the fact it's being subsidised by the ratepayer, you can absorb that low price. And that's what's so bad about this thing, because it's taking advertising away from other legitimate newspapers.
It's also taking all the public announcements that councils are under an obligation to make. They used to make via local newspapers and pay for them. And if all councils just started doing that again, rather than using their own publications to get the material out, they would begin to put a bit of life back into the local press. I mean, I think no matter where any of us stand, I mean, any journalist from any part of the spectrum would say newspapers, so-called newspapers produced by councils, are a really bad idea, and councils should stop being afraid of their critics and be prepared to do what the Americans did, 150 years ago, which was to start the American press 150 years ago was practically supported by government advertising and cheap transport costs and things like that, and not having to pay. So that all this incredibly vibrant press that we all look back at and think was somehow emerged out of capitalism was actually very heavily subsidised by governments who believed in democracy and thought that plurality was important and found every possible way they could to support the enterprise of people who wanted to produce news. And
if
we
it
don't.
was critical of the even
if they were critical
of the administration,
which is what the VAT subsidy does in this country, but it doesn't apply to online. Yeah. So there's no subsidies.
But it comes down to trust between politicians and the press. Now, we have quite good relationships, I'd like to think, with most of our politicians, but and it is the ability to have an off-the-record conversation with them, but also for them to take the hit when they've done something wrong, and not to get onto us and start acting like a spoilt child when they get bad publicity for something. And I think that's kind of quite a brave politician who says, let's have say a completely, I'm open, you know, and that's complete, you know, and I'll say sorry when I have to, because they should, as we do, when we get things wrong. But it's that relationship of trust, but knowing actually, now I'm grown up enough to know that I can have good relationships with politicians, and, you know, and we can go ahead and do stories, and if they don't like something, they'll say, oh, Hannah, didn't like that, you know, but tough, because if it's wrong, tell me about it. But otherwise, as long as it's fair and it's balanced, it's right and it's truthful. But I think politicians are, like a lot of us, you know, quite sensitive, and they don't like to be exposed, you know. And but that is our job to do that.
I mean, stories I hear from local journalists, whether they're on newspapers or online, you know, I mean, I've covered 3 different mayors, all big, forceful personalities. You know, I've made swinging attacks on all of them. Never had any kind of backlash from the mayors or their teams, and yet I hear from people who've run fairly innocuous, you know, mildly critical stories about local councils where they're treated like pariah. I mean, it's just, you know, there's a very sensitive group of politicians in some local councils, particularly ones who are not used to rigorous local political scrutiny or where they've had a long-term domination. But they want to control it. And as I say, you know, this building has always been very different from that. But what I think the mayor could do is I think he could look at crystallising. I mean, if you apply for a job as a press officer here, if you look into one of the staff handbooks, there is a line in it that says we have a diverse media, it's online, it's radio, it's broadcast, and we expect you to treat them equally. I mean, that's basically what it boils down to. And I think that is best practice. But, you know, and I think one of the things that the mayor could look at doing is following on from the Transport for London transparency strategy, which has become a gold standard in local authority transparency, and look at crystallising City Hall's approach to and the functional body's approach to democratic accountability, and working with London councils to get that adopted as the standard for London, so that whichever local authority you deal with, you know you're going to have the same kind of reaction, a positive one.
I think if we can draw other people's comments on what the mayor should be doing to the sort of final point, that'd be helpful. But it's a valid point in this context. Caroline, do you want to continue with your?
Yes. I mean, should I sort of would you like me to move? Or are you asking me to move on? Yes. We've heard a lot about amateur content appearing in the media, and papers using local people to feed them stories. What is this just a sort of cover for there not being enough money to pay journalists, or is there how can we use that kind of citizen journalism to help with that scrutiny rather than it just being a question of kind of send us. I think it was the News Quest who were inviting readers to send them articles as close to the style of a news story as you possibly can. Well, that seems to be doing journalists out of a job, but also using volunteers unfairly to deliver journalism and without being paid. Maybe Laura.
I come in on that. Yeah, yes. I mean, I think that there has been quite a big focus around this idea of user-generated content as a potential fig leaf or solution for the fact that so many staff have gone from the industry. But actually, it isn't a solution. I mean, of course, there've always been contributions from people and letters pages and what have you, and that's a kind of normal part of things. But in terms of kind of asking people to submit news stories in the way that you describe, I mean, it's ludicrous. And we've seen it particularly, I think, with photographers. There's been a huge loss of staff photographers across the industry, and looking for submitted content to replace that is just not a solution to it. Often the quality of material that's submitted is not good enough, or it still needs to be edited, so it's not actually saving time. In some cases, it's actually generating work for the fewer number of journalists that remain in the offices dealing with it. And it seems particularly kind of strange at a time when there's a lot of effort going into trying to build the digital side of things, to be dispensing with photographers when pictures and video are so important to that. And also, if you're a member of the public and you're being asked to to do these things, I think, you know, you're in a very strange position where you might come forward with your material, you submit it for free, and then suddenly you're in a position where you're being asked to buy it back again. I mean, it's just a kind of ridiculous situation.
Mm-hmm.
Caroline, can I come in on that? So when I was on my weekly newspaper, the Glamorgan Gazette, in my state, which is where I'm from, there's a lovely old man called Vernon who used to drive down in his tiny car every Sunday and bring me a piece of paper that he'd written the local news on. And that is user-generated content. And in no way was that a fig leaf for anything. That was very important. What Vernon said mattered to the people of my stake. And what Laura dismisses as, of course, people send in letters, and of course they do, that's user-generated content. And that's very important. And then in Croydon recently, far from it being something that replaces something else, I brought in letters, I brought in 2 pages of community news, I brought in local nostalgia. Most of this is submitted by the readers, and that's not, I haven't stopped doing anything else. That's because I think this is important to a local newspaper. It's part of that engagement which Eric is talking about. You know, it's essential and it's core. The idea that readers can write in a news story, that's a nonsense in my view, and that's a million miles away from user-generated content. If it's properly curated, if it's well used, it is, in my experience, incredibly valuable for readers and to develop a sense of place and a sense of ownership, and is crucial to the success of the print titles in particular, where it is almost niche to those titles. It doesn't do that well online, but it is something that nourishes the print titles, and that's really what we're about. Grow an online audience and protecting print as long as possible.
So it's a question of kind of making sure that it's not journalism on the cheap, but that it is about a relationship with, I think someone talked about the precious readership, which is, you know, really, if people are engaged.
It's another investment. It's another way that people can feel that they take ownership of it. It's part of their news, part of their community, and it's more local faces. And we've always used, as Kerry said, we've always used, it's nothing new, we've always used contributors, unpaid contributors in the regions to write columns. We can't, I don't think any newspaper's ever been able to cover anything. Yeah, but it's all the local people, so that's not new. It obviously does have to be subbed and edited. Obviously, we have to carefully watch it, you know, for any legals, etc., etc. But it's valued. It is very important, and we shouldn't be snooty. I think sometimes journalists can be a bit snooty sometimes as well about copy, but it is part of our readership. Yeah.
I think it's interesting because it harks back to the point that Andrew was making to you about exclusives, and is the digital revolution hasn't just changed the business models, it's actually changed journalism. And the people no longer expect to be told and to be directed and to be, you know, there's a much more participatory air in everything from papers to broadcasting to online. The whole model has changed and is changing, and we can't hark back to some sort of some sort of, you know, model that worked in the 50s and 60s. The whole landscape has completely changed.
We can't hark back, but we do need to make sure
yeah, no,
that
we
there is
do.
still scrutiny.
But you know, if you target sort of one or two elements I think we fail to understand just how much everything is changing and the pace of change around us.
And just because I know Fiona's very keen for me to finish, this issue of digitisation and how this is changing journalism, does this leave some groups particularly marginalised? For instance, older people, people with disabilities can have less online access, and you know that sort of perhaps sort of suggests the importance of maintaining a paper-based model for local papers. But does anyone have anything they want to say about those marginalised?
I think that's right. I mean, older groups do tend to be amongst those who are marginalised, but actually low-income younger people are also amongst those who are digitally excluded. The Mayor's just announced some people obviously be surprised to hear me sitting here sort of advocate, but he's just announced a trial of a tablet lending scheme through local libraries, targeting specifically older groups and those who are socially disadvantaged and younger age groups. And I think that's the right kind of approach, because people focus, they say also older people are more likely to be, but actually that's not entirely true. There are people through income levels or for education or for simply family opportunities who are digitally excluded, and I think that you need to be wary of just assuming it's older people who are being disservice that way. Actually, if you want younger people interested in news, and if it is a case that they get it online, but actually you need to make sure all younger people have got the opportunity to go online, and lots of them don't do. So I think it's not all skewed towards the older age group.
Anyone else on digital exclusion?
Yeah, just to say that I think you're right in terms of your point about print, because it's another example of where there is a kind of unique selling point that newspapers have. So not underestimating the importance of print, and I think in terms of access, because we're also seeing, for example, libraries closing, it's more difficult for people to access the digital editions of things, and so having that printed product and that kind of opportunity to present the printed product in that way is something that these organisations have as a unique selling point.
I think newspapers are ironically particularly important for young people. And the reason for this is that they are digitally excluded in a way which we don't really think about very much. And that is that successive research looking at people's use of news has shown that the more choice available of things to do online, the less likely certain groups of people are to find news at all. And younger people are the least likely to find news. And we used to depend on the fact that everybody watched television, and therefore they kind of bumped into the news. It was referred to as the trapping effect of news. But there is now absolutely overwhelming evidence that the diversity of opportunities for entertainment online and the lack of any particular one thing that everybody does means that we have a growing group of news excluded. And news excluded is not the same as digitally excluded. These are people who it doesn't occur to them to look at news. And if you walk down the street, if I come from my home in Stamford Hill to Dalston, you will probably pass 2 news agents if you walked the entire way. We no longer even have kind of the placards that you used to see. You couldn't have walked through London 10, 15 years ago without knowing what the headlines were. It would have been impossible. But it is now perfectly possible for groups of news excluded, and I think we need to use that term, people, to have absolutely no idea what's going on around them. None. And we think that social media is doing it for them, and indeed I interviewed students who thought if anything's really important enough, it's going to just come up the top of YouTube. But actually, the stuff that's happening around you does not come to you via YouTube. Which is why, going back to the Evening Standard, having the Evening Standard on public transport system, I've seen kids just pick it up and read it for something to do, who would probably not, in their daily lives, are not encountering news at all. And I think this is something, there are now schools projects trying to bring news into schools, which I think perhaps that's something else that you could be picking up on. There is I do have an interest here. There is a project called the Student Voice, which is trying to put journalism into schools through journalism clubs. But I know there are other ways of doing this, and I'm really interested that you go to visit schools. In Norway, the press organisation regularly goes into all the schools to talk about the importance of journalism. And it's not incidental, I think, that
we get
Norway
such
has,
a good reception to
yeah,
schools.
Norway has
There's
the
so much
highest
interest.
news readership in the world. But they still think it's important enough that now that the rates are going down by a few percentages, they are beginning to go into schools to talk about news. This is something we could be doing.
And schools actually want our news, their news, in our newspapers. They want it in the newspapers. They don't want it online. They ask for it in the newspapers. They want to see it in the Friday or the Tuesday edition. But so, I apologise, but I will just say one thing. So we talk about how we gather news, and we want to do this, we want to do that, and we need to keep going. But it is a business as well. And the most important thing is we do need to make money, because we do need to pay people to provide this vital service. And it is a public service. It is a public service to local people, to keep them informed and hopefully independently informed, so they make up their own minds. But it has to make money, and I think that's where we're all struggling, is revenue. And it's no good without that.
Okay. Thank you. Before we move on to Joe, very quickly, Kemi had a question on diversity.
Yes, I
Picking
did.
up on something Laura said earlier, which I think would be important to cover.
It was about the figures you quoted for the newspaper industry being 94% white, and I seem to remember you asking if the mayor could do something about getting more students into more ethnic minority, presumably more diverse population into journalism schools. Is that what you were asking?
Well, one suggestion that we're putting forward in the paper that we shared with the committee was about funding and championing bursaries to help people access the industry and to grow that so needed diversity. I mean, the NUJ, we have a mechanism by which we support journalists into the industry, and I think it would be something that would be very constructive for the committee to look at and see if that's something that the mayor could look at taking forward to help.
So it's not about, because that I think is a good idea. I would not, on the other hand, support getting more people into journalism schools if they're not going to get the jobs afterwards and then they incur the debt. So that wouldn't be something, that's what I thought you were proposing. But if it is to support people who are starting off in the industry, then I think that's a good idea.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to Joe, and over to you, Joanne.
I want to ask about the future, and particularly Martin and the BBC scheme, but then come to about local, hyperlocal and blogging. But Michael, if I can start with you. The BBC is investing in local journalism, and you've got an £8 million scheme where you're going to put local reporters across the country, 12 in London, and their aim is to generate local news stories that then other publications and media can use free of charge. And on the face of it, I think that looks like a really good scheme and really welcome. But I'm just wondering if there's some unintended consequences around that. So I would actually like to ask you a little bit about the purposes behind your scheme, and perhaps in that you could, I think one of the main ones is we've heard about the cuts to local newspapers today. Will this scheme not exacerbate that? If you're creating local content, why does Hannah need to employ all the journalists she's got, for example, if she can get news directly from you?
Yeah, I think if you look at the context of how that came about, I mean, it was at a national level, at a government level, really, with concerns about some of the things you've been talking about a local democracy deficit, and particularly about whether council meetings were being covered, that sort of thing, and came out of concerns that were expressed to the DCMS in their consultations about the charter renewal. And I think if I can go into some detail of how the scheme works, there's funding for 150 reporters around the country, and there's quite a tight, specific remit on how these reporters will work. They will actually be employed by the newspapers, not by us. We're funding them. There is quite a strict agreement that's been, I think it's just about sorted now, isn't it? There's been quite a long process about agreement on how they will work, but in the end they will be employed by the individual newspaper groups who will win the contracts. A bit like about how we work with independent companies in making television now. It's not dissimilar in that sort of way. But what they will do is they will be to very specific roles concerning councils and one or two other public institutions. They will supply material that will be available not just to the individual newspaper groups, but to the BBC, and in fact to any other relevant and approved users. So it is a way of trying to help, because I don't think the BBC is the solution to lots of the issues that you've been talking about today. but it was a way of trying to help the industry as a whole address some of the concerns there were about a local democracy deficit.
Okay. Is it fair to say that therefore you're subsidising the costs of local
I think we recruit them alongside the BBC. There are recruitment. They're with us for 2 years, so it's like recruiting a reporter with us for 2 years. There's 12 in London, bundle of 12, and you basically bid for the contract. So we could bid for a contract, we could have 2 or 3 reporters, and their job will be to scrutinise the councils. So that is their only job. It's not, I believe, it's not to do all the human interest stories and all the other.
Not, absolutely
it is
not.
purely local public scrutiny.
Yeah, there is also a clause in the agreement that the companies are not allowed to remove someone from a post for that to be replaced. No. There's quite a lot of I mean, I can't go into a lot of the detail now till we've agreed it, but there are some quite strict criteria about how this is going to work.
And how have you picked which? Will your 12 in London cover all of London, or is it depending if Hannah employs one of is your reporter only going to cover the boroughs that she particularly covers?
No, I mean there is a bidding process for the newspaper industry and other approved bidders to bid for the contracts, and we'll just try and come up. I mean, clearly. You could have an infinite number of journalists in London to try and tackle this, as you could in much of the rest of the country. So we'll have to come up with a system that actually, as fairly as possible, distributes them around London.
I see it's embellishing what we
absolutely.
do, really. I mean,
absolutely.
Our reporters, we don't get round to all the meetings, so they would do all the other...
I'm just wondering,
how do the companies bid?
Presumably, what salary will they be on? I'm just wondering, will the terms and conditions be akin to, or they will be like super reporters, they'll be the ones that are paid?
No, again, there's an agreement with the newspaper industry. Off the top of my head, I think it's 24,000 and 26 in London, if I remember rightly, something like that. I'd have to check back on the precise amount, but it's about that sort of level.
I'm going to open it up because I think there's people might have some comments. Laura?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for your questions. I think it's very interesting to hear the responses on this particular scheme. I mean, I think the NUJ members who work on both the newspaper side of things and in the BBC have serious concerns about this scheme. And don't think it will address the problem that's been identified, which is this question of the democratic deficit. And I think you hit the nail on the head really with the questions that you were asking, because there isn't any guarantee, there isn't any control that the BBC can have over whether or not, if people are appointed into these positions, the newspaper organisations won't see that as a reason or an opportunity to further cut their own staff. And there have certainly been concerns raised during the kind of low-key trials that there have been about the fact that work that would have been done by specific reporters in a specific site is actually being covered by somebody else. And I know that people are making reassuring noises around the fact that people won't be diverted into doing other things if they take on these roles. But actually, we've seen this a lot, that there's kind of mission creep in terms of particular roles that people have, that, you know, where there are gaps emerging, where there's short staffing, you know, people are often asked, can you just do this, can you just cover this? And so there's a danger, I think, that people would be drawn in to that kind of situation and wouldn't be able to concentrate on these specific roles.
How are you going to monitor?
Well, I think there's two. I can't, and you know, the BBC can't tell Trinity Mirror or anyone else how many people they should employ. So, you know, and I think if we'd come up with a scheme where there was those sort of concerns, there would be rightly some concern about what is the BBC doing meddling in other people's businesses in this sort of way. I think the way that the contracts are drawn up and the specific roles are very clear about what these people will be doing. We will be monitoring those contracts in the exact same way we would if we had an independent contract with a TV company, to make sure that those criteria are met. And there will be positions in place that if it's being abused, that the contract will end. So I genuinely think this is this is an additional investment for the whole industry to tackle particular areas where there's been concern that we've not been, the coverage is no longer there or has never been there to a certain extent. And I mean, if you think, in London, I run a political team of essentially 3 reporting staff, which gives quite a lot of coverage to obviously what goes on in this building. But those 3 staff are also supposed to do all of the MPs in London, and the particular London issues around MPs, long before you ever get to the 32 boroughs. So I actually think, from my point of view, I think we're going to get a lot of good new material that will be extremely useful to us, that will be extremely useful to my colleagues in the local papers, who, to be absolutely frank, we don't really compete with at that level in that sort of way. And I think this scheme will actually provide a lot more journalism, a lot more scrutiny, and a lot more content, to be honest.
And it will drive, you see, the stories that they'll be covering, it's just local authorities. So they don't even do the follow-ups to the local authority stories. So if they go to a meeting and they're making cuts to social care and it outrages our readers, it's up to our reporters, other reporters, to do the follow-ups and do the interviews. And I don't think there are any actually negatives, because they're doing something that we're not really doing properly at the moment. So if I can have 2 or 3 more people going out to Lambeth, Southwark, Lewisham, etc., covering that, it gives my other reporters a chance to do the work that they're currently doing now, but better, and with the relief that they're not torn to have to go to a meeting or do something they can't do at the moment.
Martin, you're reaching to get in.
A question.
I think it is a positive. I mean, I do share some of the concerns about if the onus ultimately comes down to the BBC managing the contracts and scrutinising them properly. Now, that seems slightly administratively heavy, and you might think that actually it'd be better for the BBC to employ people and then second them, and if they were being asked to do jobs that they didn't like, they could phone up the BBC or their HR and say, actually, I'm being asked to do stories that I'm not supposed to do. And so, I mean, you might, personally, I think that might have been a better approach, but I think so long as the safeguards are in place, so long as they're managed properly, then I think it has the potential to do, firstly, what the BBC is really there for, which is to help, under its own brand and others, to fill in the gaps that the commercial sector can't do. But actually also to do what Michael's team does on BBC Radio and TV, which is to bring in extra voices. I mean, I benefit from that. I go on BBC Radio, I go on Sunday Politics London, I go on BBC TV. They're very good, actually, at BBC London at bringing other people from outside the organisation in and giving them access to their viewers and their listeners, and giving them a chance to bring their extra scrutiny or their different take on things. I think if this brings that down to borough level, then I think that's a win for everybody. But I think it all hinges on how well the BBC manages the contracts, and that's going to be the key part. And that's why I wonder whether actually it might have been better if they'd adopted the approach of the BBC employs 12 journalists and it's the constant to local papers, and then the protection is the BBC employees, and there are stricter controls on what people can do because their line manager is outside. But there are obviously practical problems if you've got a line manager who's outside the organisation you're working in. So, but I think so long as the BBC maintain the contracts and enforce them, because the danger sometimes is, particularly in the public sector, you have a contract that says the contract's been breached, we should pull it, and what often happens is people don't want the headline that it's failed, and we all get this as journalists, and so there's a private conversation and people agree not to do things, but actually the creep becomes embedded, and I think that's the danger.
I think the points that Martin's making are really important, because this is licence fee payers' money, and it's effectively passing from licence fee payers into private organisations. So the question of transparency and how that money will be used are very important questions. There needs to be scrutiny, absolute scrutiny of that.
Angela?
I've got 3 questions actually. One is, we know that most of the local press are fairly neutral in their coverage, and therefore the BBC requirement for balance is not something they're going to find too much of a problem. I'm assuming the Evening Standard is not one of the organisations that's able to bid for these reporters, and if it is, are there special controls being put in place to ensure that, well, for a start, is the Evening Standard going to be able to bid?
Well, I'm not actually certain we're at a point where we've actually decided everyone who's a qualifying organisation or not.
But neutrality, is that built in?
Well, the neutrality of the people and the way that they work is built in, but I think it's an understanding of in the end, these people will be supplying content. And I think, Hannah made the point that, that in the end, the paper's journalists will still be following up stories, will still be doing angles, will still be developing stories in the way that works for their readers and their paper. So I think it's much more about things just being covered. And yes, there will be strict interpretation of how that will work. And those criteria will be published. They'll be in the public domain. And in fact, I was in a union meeting yesterday with Laura's colleagues where we were running through the process as at the point we're at now. So there's the transparency levels will be very open.
Yeah. And the other question was, will people who are currently doing the sort of political beat on a newspaper be able to apply for these positions?
They're 2-year contracts. They're 2-year contracts, aren't they? So they just run, so they expire after 2 years.
But so we're looking at a situation where if somebody is currently doing the political coverage on a newspaper which gets in one of these BBC-funded reporters, the person who's currently doing the job as a political reporter will no longer be able to actually do that because they would be doubling up.
Yes, but I think there is a specific clause about if a person comes from a specific position in the newspapers now that has to be replaced. And I think the sort of job of a political reporter on a local newspaper, which has a pretty wide remit, the limitations around what this person would be expected to do, that's not going to be a substitute in that sort of way.
You are having discussions with the NUJ about how it will work?
Yes.
Yeah, that's helpful. Okay. Can I turn then to Martin and Linda about the role of, I suppose, calling them hyper-locals, in terms of Linda, but also blogs. Martin, in terms of news coverage, and I suppose in the future, do you see yours as being a model that's going to work? Is it going to be sustainable? Can you make a living at it?
I think there's this sort of idea out there that somehow sites like mine or something can replace local newspapers, and I don't think that's possible. I don't think it's desirable either. I think traditional papers with long-standing connections to areas are essential, and I don't think that the kind of purely online publications that we produce should be seeking to replace them, because in any event all you'll be doing is bringing the same structural problems that they have in terms of monetizing the content, producing the content, just transplanting it online where actually it's already harder to make money anyway. I think what you can provide is a different kind of journalism and a different kind of coverage, and maybe in my case a form of topic specialism that you can explore at a different length and in a different way than maybe you can do in a newspaper. And I mean, a lot of the stories that I cover are not the same kind of stories that the Standard or the local papers would cover, or even London Live. Sometimes they pick up, Michael's team pick up stories that I've run. Sometimes I work in conjunction with people like Tim at the BBC and others. But the sort of catalyst for them is maybe comes from a different take from where the BBC or ITV or the Standard would start from, and so I think that they should be seen as a complementary form of outlet and form of journalism rather than as a replacement. And in terms of money, it's very difficult to make money as a journalist. I think Laura's probably got the figures, but I read something, I think it was Press Gazette, where something like a third of people who bill themselves as journalists are on some form of state benefit. So these are not high income roles, particularly for freelancers. And so I think the idea that people sometimes have, which is I could give up my job and go and write about something that I care about, and the money will come rolling in, that is fantasy land. That doesn't work. It's a lot of work. It's not chucking up 400 words a day and going off and playing with your PlayStation. It's a big job, and you need to be persistent. But there's also a credibility issue. You know, I mean, we were talking about earlier with the attitudes to press officers and press and politicians and other public bodies. You know, you will not always, whatever you feel you should get, you will not always get the access that you want. You will not always get treated the way that you want, and particularly when you're dealing with local councils, particularly those that are not as welcome to scrutiny, newspapers, print newspapers with a long pedigree and a legal team will be much more able in many cases to persist and to push and assert their rights than some guy working on their own, or sort of, because people will not always be sure how far can I push this before they simply say go away, well you can't come into the meeting. And so I think that the papers are much better. I mean, I don't have that problem covering City Hall, I don't have that problem covering the Met, but I recognise also that I'm in a different place from a lot of other local publications, and I think that if you spoke to some of them about the difficulty they get trying to get into some London boroughs, or to get taken seriously, or to be treated even just with respect, not even to be taken seriously, to be treated with respect as individuals rather than being bullied or shouted down or you know, or berated for running perfectly fair stories. You don't have to delve too far deep on Twitter to find individual councillors gunning after local journalists, local campaign groups, and these things turning very ugly. They wouldn't do it with a journalist who works for one of the papers represented here, but they will do it online. And I do know people who have sort of stepped back from doing some of that work because of the reaction they've got. And politics can sometimes be very brutal and partisan. You guys are obviously elected politicians, you understand that. But if you're a small publisher or an individual journalist or somebody who would like to be a journalist, and you find yourself in the firing line from half a dozen local councils because you've dared write something critical about a planning decision, it can be very off-putting, and not everybody is robust enough to just push back. So I think sit alongside, replace absolutely not. And in terms of funding, I think most people probably do something else. You know, I do content writing and copywriting and have other publications. I think that I think making enough money from a single publication to pay all your bills and to feed yourself and to pay for a mortgage, I think is some people can do it, but it's very, very rare.
Linda, I mean, you really are hyper-local, aren't you? Talking about your circulation figures earlier. So what role do you see that you play that is different from the others?
Well, we are hyper-local in the sense that we see Brixton as our catchment area, although we have a very loose definition these days of where Brixton begins and ends. And that's partly in response to our readers who are asking us to cover things that are as far away as Clapham or Tulse Hill or within the actual borough. And I guess where Martin and I differ is we do have a publication, and as I said, the circulation is 12,000. They go within a week. We could do many, many more, but it's the financial model that is our problem. We are also almost a traditional local paper in the sense of what we cover. We have the same pace as a local paper. We've got sports, we've got news, features, and so on and so forth. Where we are different is that we do drill down to really hyper-local, particularly when we're looking for Brixton heroes, local stories, but we still look for those big issues that we feel should concern the general population. So the school pollution along the high streets was our big story last time, library closures, planning ascents that are... So we are no different in some senses from a local paper, but the difference is we haven't got a financial model that would sustain paid employees in the same way.
So it's really you, is it? It's not sustainable for anything other than a...
It's sustainable in the sense that it's a community paper staffed by volunteers, but all the volunteers are journalists or trainee journalists who are freelance or who are doing it in semi-retirement as hobbies. We have aspirations to move that model so that we can take on youngsters on living wage and pay them. And I think we could do that by a combination of advertising sponsorship. Some of our biggest advertisers actually do it as a corporate social responsibility community input. For instance, the Business Improvement District is our biggest advertiser. schools because they want to relate to parents in terms of what's changed and whether they're good schools or not. There is a way to do it, but it can't be advertising alone. I think we've crowdfunded. We crowdfunded for a news reporter, and that worked, but that's time limited, and so obviously one could do that for a revamp of the website, but not for long-term employment. So the other model we're looking at with community and business groups in the area is whether we could have a subscription cooperative model that would then enable us to employ young journalists and make it a viable concern. So I think that's maybe the slight difference, and it can't be done online.
This is your community interest company, is it, that you're thinking of?
Yeah.
Are you aware that's happening anywhere else at the moment?
Bristol.
I mean, we've been focusing, of course, on effectively print or digital, written journalism. But actually, the other thing that's happening in London are community radio stations. And I contribute to one. I can't talk about the business model because I'm not involved in the management. But in Wandsworth, we have Wandsworth Radio, which is set up by a journalist and produces original news bulletins and carries out interviews, and the local MP and Assembly Member Cooper, who's a local AM, comes in, and we've been involved. I mean, she and I have been inside the studio doing political discussion programmes during the mayoral election. The local MP, Sadiq's successor down in Tooting, and I were on a phone. So there's other forms of journalism emerging as those costs come down too. But in all of them, whilst the costs are coming down, making the money in order to cover the costs is a lot of hard work for people. And there is a big difference, and this is the bit that I think is really crucial for people to understand, is there is a big difference. I think really what Eric was saying, there's a difference between making enough money to cover your costs because you're not having to deliver for shareholders, which is a perfectly fine approach, and a different thing if you're needing to make money for a parent company or for a shareholder. And the business models are different, and they're both perfectly valid forms of ownership, but the idea of some friends setting up a radio station or a local news site is very different from something which has to pay long-term employment. You create long-term employment, deliver on contracted advertising commitments. They are different things, and I think too often people think you can just do these things online and it's cheap and the money will come in. They're not the same. They are not replacements for each other. And I think actually an example of that is you see, London Live, which has had to cut its commitments to original journalism and its original content virtually every year since it got its license. It doesn't really deliver. If you look back at the original license that it was granted, the original conditions in which it was granted its license from Ofcom, the output and the commitments have been cut so many times, it doesn't really bear relation to the station. And of course, because it's found competing with ITV London and BBC London is much harder than saying, well, we'll do it without having all the historic costs that come with it. It's actually much more difficult to make money from this content than people think.
Thank you very much. I think we're drawing to the end, and thank you very much for everybody for bearing with us. But I'd like to pass on to Sean for...
to be brief, Chair.
That would be helpful, thank you. Thanks for bearing with us to the end.
Given dominance of Google and Facebook at advertising, is there any way that they could be supporting supporting the revenue of local newspapers? There's a report by the Media Standards Trust in America where they looked at providing public funds for journalism that did work around public engagement. And we've talked briefly about this democratic deficit and how the BBC are involved in helping that. Ultimately, that's public funds. Is there some way we could be speaking to the likes of Google to help with that?
I think the problem with companies like Google and Facebook, I mean, people have talked about how many Facebook likes they get. I think one of the big problems, I wanted to say this earlier, is that in a rush to move online without really knowing what online meant, people were happy to subsume their brands onto Facebook, and all that happened was they made Mark Zuckerberg even richer. And they've lost control of their brands because it's now just become a page within Facebook. And I think that actually if you want to make money online, then you need to eschew people like Facebook. You need to say, we might post a link to what we've written, but we're not posting whole articles or entire content or spending money creating content that you then give away to Facebook's readers so that Facebook can sell more advertising. Personally, I find that a nonsense of a business model. You know, I have a Facebook page, I do nothing to promote it. It's just there to stop anybody else taking the brand, the site name, because it's a registered trademark, and the site automatically posts a link to everything that goes up. And that's all that happens. And I don't even know how many followers it gets. And if it's 1 or 60, I really couldn't care, because I have no interest in being on Facebook. And I think that people need to... These companies have for a long time masqueraded as journalism's friends. We'll help you get your content out there. But actually they are not journalism's friends. And we've seen last week with Google, which owns YouTube, and its reaction when it was showing some of the extremist content that was online. It does not want to take any responsibility for the content that's on its platform. Now, it's different for Michael and the BBC, because they are publicly funded. They have an obligation to get their content out as widely as possible. So they are platform neutral, and it's different for them. But if you're trying to make money from your content, effectively giving it away to Facebook's readers is the wrong approach. And I think they are not going to want to fund content that they don't get to benefit from the audience from. So the idea that they are going to generously give 0.5% of their advertising revenue to local media in the UK, I don't think that's going to happen. But I also think that the media need to become much more sceptical about what the end game for those, because you know we've seen about the fake news content in America with Trump, but Facebook do not accept responsibility for the stuff that's posted on there. They're happy for you to post it because they're happy, whether you're an extremist Trump fan or whether you're an extremist Jeremy Corbyn supporter, they're happy to take whatever content brings you to their site. But a lot of that stuff is intellectually pretty shaky. It wouldn't make it into the pages of most newspapers or reputable news sites. And I think that people need to stop treating those companies as the solution to the problems of the trade.
So we've got a working relationship, as anyone who's a sort of credible modern journalist has, with Facebook and Google, and there's no doubt that that's been hoovering up all the digital revenue that's out there without actually investing in the expensive practice that is journalism. So I do think we would be very keen to rebalance our relationship with them. But that said, they're not the only ones in the marketplace. The traditional pillars that local newspapers use to cleave to for their revenue, so property, that's gone to Rightmove. Motors has gone to Auto Trader, and jobs has gone to 90% of our jobs revenue has gone to a local jobs boards. So Google and Facebook, yes, but in terms of where we used to get our revenue from advertising, that's also been disrupted with these very big players in the market. So that's kind of
I mean, again, an opportunity completely missed by the British media organisations. In Norway, the biggest publisher also runs the advertising platforms, which is why they're not in quite so much trouble as they are here. But having said that, I mean, I do think one of the most interesting things that's happened over the last week or 2 weeks is that as the big advertisers, the brand advertisers, begin to withdraw from Google, mainly because they don't understand how programmatic advertising works, they went in because they didn't understand how programmatic advertising works, and they're running scared because they don't understand how programmatic works. But what will happen is that as they come out, Google is going to have to think about its own revenue and how it's going to change things. And I think that might turn out to be quite good for publishers, because publishers, if you are advertising via a publisher, you know where your advertising is, and that's quite in the current climate. I think that we might see two things happening. We might see a shift back to what advertisers see as being reliable advertising, and we might also see Google having to raise the cost of advertising, which I think, ironically, might be a good thing. Because at the moment, one of the reasons why the news media has lost out so badly is that the cost of advertising through Google is so cheap. But as Google loses, as soon as Google starts to lose the big players, they're going to have to do they're not going to be able to clean up their act just by flicking a few switches. It's a much, much bigger issue than that, because of the whole way in which programmatic actually works. So we may be, I hope that we might find ourselves in a situation where some of that advertising starts coming back. But frankly, I think that, and I don't think it's something that we can do here, but I do think that the big platforms should be, as they have been asked to do in France, they should be giving money back to a pool, which should be, in France what they've done is they're collecting money from Google and Facebook and they're using it as an innovation fund, which is sort of helpful, except that nobody's come up. Well, there is one new news website that started in France, which is successful.
Okay.
Innovation isn't.
Chair, in the interest of brevity, I'm going to jump straight to our last question and just say, is there anything in particular you think the Mayor could be doing to support local media, the development, the survival of, is there something that you are aware of that the Mayor from this board could do to help that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think I flagged at the start of the session that the NUJ has got a week of action around local press coming up from the end of this week. It would be great to have the Mayor's support in that and to use that as a real platform for trying to engage on some of these issues and to talk to organisations about proper pay and staffing levels in the capital's newspaper offices, and to really look at, I think there's a kind of huge opportunity, partly to what Angela was saying actually, to really focus on quality journalism and to use that to kind of combat the so-called fake news phenomena by having properly staffed, properly trained journalists who are producing relevant local content for their communities and really standing up for their communities. So there is a kind of massive opportunity there, and it would be fantastic to have the Mayor's support in doing some of that. And we've got some other practical suggestions that we can share with the committee around diversity, as we talked about, and so some of the other things that we could take forward from today.
Okay, if there's anything in detail, I'm sure the Chair would love some written content.
Yeah, I think if you send it in to Matt, that would be really helpful. Thanks.
I'm going to stop there, Chair.
Okay, thank you. I think if anybody's got any burning issues that haven't come up through the discussion, please do send them in and we'll get them circulated round committee members. But bearing in mind that we have run over time, I'd like to now thank guests for their contributions. I would stress we don't normally have quite so many people on a panel, but it was actually really helpful today to have such a wide range of views of an issue that, as it was pushed out along at the beginning, this is something that the whole Assembly has debated and had a sort of consensus around our concerns around the future of local media at our plenary sessions on at least 2 occasions when I've been here. So I think it is something we are concerned about, and I think today's discussion's given us a huge amount to think about. So can I ask the committee to note the report and our discussion?
Yeah,
thank you. And can I ask the committee to delegate authority to me as chair to agree any output arising from the discussion?
Agreed.
Yeah, thank you. And can we please note our updated work programme for the next year that we had a discussion on earlier? And can I ask the committee to delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the deputy chair and party group lead members to agree the scope and work programme activities for the committee meetings in May, June and July 2017? Thank you. And can we please note the joint letter from myself and the Mayor to the Intercontinental Hotels Group in relation to the commitment made in 2012 that within 5 years all staff in their London hotels would be paid at least the London Living Wage. This letter was signed after the publication of the agenda. However, a copy has been provided to members this morning or will be provided to members this afternoon. And just subject to confirmation at the annual meeting of the Assembly on 3rd of May 2017, the next meeting of the Economy Committee is scheduled for Wednesday the 17th of May at 2 p.m. in the Chamber at City Hall, and there's no urgent business, and so that concludes the meeting. However, I would like to thank all the staff supporting the committee for the work they've done while I have been chair this year. So thank you very much for that, and I'll now end the meeting. Thank you.
Sorry?
One more call. You would have been
I'll send you my email.
Yeah.
business cards on. But I'll just get my personal email.
Well, I shall go.